and I'll probably be using it for a while just because I'm cheap. Hey guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Cooler Master Q300L. Now, it's a slightly older case. I picked it up for about 40 bucks to replace my antiquated Antec P280 that I'd been using for a good long while prior. And that one, well, it came from an era where it was still common to have 5 1/4 inch bays and 3.5 inch bays for external use. So, simpler times to an extent, but it was far and beyond way too large for what I needed after I had to platform upgrade from an Asus Sabertooth 990 FX revision 2 and my FX 8350 processor to my budget-constrained B450 and Ryzen 3 1200 that I was using for a few months there as well. And basically my choice for finding this case is I didn't hate the way it looked. It was seemingly all right for just micro ATX builds, and it was only about 40 bucks. So that was the key point for me, is the fact that it was only about 40 bucks. It's got all sorts of magnetic dust filters. It somehow managed to fit an almost, right around 12-inch graphics card. I mean, granted, it takes a little bit of wedging and angles to get it in there just right. The front, top, and bottom all have, well, the front and top have magnetic dust filters. The one on the bottom has these little pegs that hold it in. So a little bit of a cop-out on that, cheap-wise, especially if you use it in the orientation where you see behind me, where it's laid down on its side. So you got the top facing this way, the side facing over towards me more. A little bit of a concession there, but it does have two USB 3.0 front panel. Those are the 5 gigabit per second ports. It's got your normal microphone, headphone jack for front panel audio. For me, the ventilation's good enough. I don't know that I'd put more than like a mid-range system in it. Right now I've got a Ryzen 5 2600 and a GTX 1070. Behind the motherboard tray, there is actually a fair amount of cable room, which is nice to see, even because it still has almost about 150 millimeters of cooler height clearance. So my Hyper 212 Evo fits in just fine. There's only about, I'd have to say, between 4 and 6 millimeters of space between the cooler and the acrylic panel. And yes, it is an acrylic panel. It's not glass. For $40, you don't get glass. So I can't really call it a con on that. I mean, at least there is a window and not just your normal $40 steel box that you'd normally get. Downside, looking at getting into the bit more of like the thermal and noise performance side of things. Thermally, it does well enough. My 2600 under, repeating Cinebench R20 load, I only ever got up to about 62 to 65 degrees C. So that's about where I'd expect it. No overclock on it with the Hyper 212. So then that's perfectly fine for me as far as temps go. I'm usually happy with anything that stays consistently under 70. Under heavy gaming loads, the graphics card does creep up a little bit further at about 67 degrees. But again, staying sub 70 is fine by me, and I don't see any performance degradation. And that's with full boosting and overclock to right around the 2 gigahertz on the core. Ventilation does pose some risks because of the lack of actual hole to metal ratio. I know Steve from Gamers Nexus did a video on the retooled version of this, the Q500L, that kind of shuffled some stuff around on the inside to make room for a full ATX board. And that just exacerbated a lot of the problems, but this does have some airflow restriction issues. And see, if you put a reasonable system in it for a $40 case and you brute force the airflow a little bit, then you're good to go. Like, I run a positive pressure with 3 120 millimeter in fans that I cannibalized from my Antec P280 that I mentioned prior. So those are, I mean, they're older fans. They're a little noisier than what you normally see now. Plus, they were the stock case fans from an Antec case from 6 years ago. And then, just a single 120 exhaust. I have 2 front, 1 top are my 3 120mm intakes. So I'm just blasting the CPU with clean air, and I'm blasting the video card with clean air whole way through, good to go. And those are the temperatures I get. Like I said before, 67 on the graphics, 62 on the processor. So solid on that. Some of the things that I don't like as much on this case is it does have some fairly limited drive storage options. You've got 1 3.5 inch and 2 2.5 inch. Now, as I move forward in progressively building this system out further into more of what I use and matching how I use my system, that'll become a little bit less of an issue because I can put an NVMe drive on my motherboard and then a couple of decent solid state drives and then a large archival hard disk drive wouldn't be too bad. Some of the other downsides, none of the thumb screws are captive, but again, a lot of these are pretty iffy for being that it's a $40 case. The one thing that isn't a little iffy is it is large for a smaller case. It's got a lot of room. It's a very standard or traditional tooling for a micro ATX case, and that it's fairly large for a micro ATX, but that allows for things to be routed cleanly, allows space for hardware that might not otherwise fit. It's a little bit loud because of having to brute force the airflow a little bit, and there's no USB-C on the front, but again, coming back to, it's a $40 case, so expectations should be tempered adequately on that. Getting into some more of my final thoughts, there's no power supply shroud, so kind of a con on that. Again, the case and the tooling, there's only so much you can really ask for. And then because the way the ventilation is, and it's not a very good honeycomb design, there's no actual subframe for the case, so the side panels are the frame, and the top and the bottom, the front and back, those are all structural to the frame. So Cooler Master was forced to keep a higher ratio of metal. I believe, like I mentioned before, Steve from Gamers Nexus did it, and he did the math. I think it was about 85% metal, 15% air. So not a whole lot of room for air to get through, which also then translates visually. If you were to put RGB fans in it, then you're running into seeing mostly just the holes and not the fans themselves, like you would out of a more traditional mesh. Now that can be alleviated with a Dremel, which is something I may consider doing in the future, just to see how things go. I gotta run by a Dremel for that first. This is kind of this case I find to be a little interesting because it's a case in point where you see more division in the PC building space between proper small form factor ITX, mini ITX, and now mini DTX boards, and then your traditional full size and extended ATX monster builds or traditional builds. The market's segmenting away from micro ATX boards for the most part, especially on the enthusiast side. Most micro ATX stuff you see it's low to middle range. You don't see any really super high end micro ATX boards for the most part. And part of that's because everyone that wants something smaller is just going all the way to mini ITX and not dealing with the micro ATX side of things. There's not a whole lot going on the specifically micro ATX case side of things. You might get a retooled version like the O11 Mini. But again, that's most practically used for a mini ITX or a mini DTX build instead of a micro ATX. It'll take a micro ATX just fine, but it limits your bottom radiator support at that point. Wrapping this up, it's a $40 case. For me, it does everything that I need it to, and I'll probably be using it for a while just because I'm cheap and I get as much use as I possibly can out of anything that I buy. And so for me, it's just fine. If you're putting together just a straight, like, middle of the road micro ATX build budget is all get out and you want something better than like a DIY PC case, then this would be your next step up, and it operates exactly as expected at the $40 price point. And for that, I'll give it a recommendation. It's worth picking up for that use case. Budget computer or mid-range computer, and you need a halfway decent box to throw it in. If you like this video, go ahead and drop a like. If you didn't, drop a dislike and leave me a comment telling me why you didn't like it. And then go ahead, subscribe so you can come back and dislike the rest of my videos. And I will see you in the next one.